This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 166, entitled Levering Young Women's FIPification. Although nowadays I just use the term FIPping because it's 2 syllables as against 5 syllables. Description. This flyer says that it's a good thing that young women are studying FIP majors, e.g. STEM, that's S-T-E-M, science, tech, engineering and math, equally with men, but that only half the battle for men's lib has been won. This flyer concentrates on what needs to be done to win the other half. For the flyer itself. Levering Young Women's FIPification, or just FIPping, so the FIPping of women. I recently wrote a flyer on the topic of young women at high school and college who study career-competent majors, for example STEM, science, tech, engineering, math, and the professions of course. I googled stats on the proportions of men and women studying these subjects and found that at US high schools about the same number of young women were studying math, physics and chemistry as young men. Yeah. The stats were from 2009. At US college level, women were studying STEM majors at about 3/4 of the rate of males, which is not as good, but still very encouraging. The Masculists want women to become FIPs, financially independent persons. The main political goal of the Masculists is to wipe out fluffydom. That is, by wiping out fluffies, traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money of a man, who expect men to pay for women to have babies living in a middle-class house that he pays for. Fluffies are the enemy of the Masculists, whom you consider to be the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century Northern American abolitionists who fought against Negro slavery, which eventually led to the US Civil War in the 1860s. The Masculists are at war against the fluffies. They see the manslavery of fluffies as slavery. Both manslavery and slavery rouse passions. Slavery is a war issue, and the Masculists are at war against the fluffies, aiming to wipe them out by refusing to have anything to do with them, not even sexing them, forcing them to rot on the shelf to extinction as punishment for being manslaving fluffies. A necessary condition for men to be freed from manslavery is that women become FIPs. And to become FIPs, women need to study FIP majors at high school and college. So the above stats are very encouraging for the Masculists. Masculists can say that the battle for men's lib is already half won. That seems true, but this flyer concentrates on the second half of the battle that still has not been won. The FIPification, or as I use nowadays, the FIPping of young women is only a necessary condition for men's lib. It's not sufficient. This flyer deals with measures needed to complete the battle for men's lib. In other words, what do the Masculists and the more politically minded of the MGTOWs need to do to liberate men from those aspects of society and gender laws that oppress them? For example, the toxicity of the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, the lack of the paternity rejection right, the dumping on men in the broadcast media, etc. It's not enough that young women become FIPs in practice. That is, that they become career competent, having studied majors that the economy values and pays good salaries for, e.g. in STEM fields, S-T-E-M, science, tech, engineering and math. Such women will still not be able to have babies until the gender laws are made men fair, and that may take a decade or more. The best that women can hope for in terms of getting a man is to twef, that is, having a relationship as a FIP woman with a FIP man, where both of them have their own apartment. Twef equals 2A, 2F equals 2 apartments, 2 FIPs. When the relationship goes sour, as nearly all do, the two of them, you may be wondering why I delay for a moment. I'm scrolling because I'm scrolling the essay on my large screen. Okay, so back to the essay. He does not pay child support because there are no kids, no alimony because the woman is a FIP. There's no divorce costs because there's no marriage. He gets to keep his apartment because she returns to her own apartment. Tway-tweffing is a lifestyle that allows a man to get the regular sex he needs from a woman without the traditional cost to be paid of being a manslave to a fluffy. He has the added advantage of it has the added advantage of forcing the woman to remain nice to him. Otherwise, he walks, and she knows that. Tway-tweffing is so easy to get out of for a man if the woman starts nagging or withholding sex or tries to mold him the way she wants, etc. The FIPification, or FIPping, of young women means that there is a greater supply of young women who are FIPs, and hence the proportion of couples who tway-tweff will only increase, and hence the proportion of traditional man-slave fluffy couples will decrease until they disappear, as they should. Even FIP women won't have babies because young men refuse to be fathers. In the US and Japan, 70% of young men under 35 refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. They are on strike against the toxicity of the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, in which roughly one married man in four is financially massacred, losing his kids with 90% probability, losing his house to his fluffy ex-wife to raise her kids in. He's forced to pay child payments to kids he barely sees, and if the ex-wife is a fluffy, he may have to pay her alimony for decades, with no moral or legal obligation on her part to get off her immoral, parasitic, fluffy ass and become a FIP. Thus the man is permanently manslave to her. She parasites off him before the divorce and after. So many young men have seen the damage done to their fathers and uncles by the toxicity of the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts that they have washed their hands of marriage and fatherhood. They see such institutions as traps, as dumb for men, so they rebel. They refuse to marry. They refuse to have kids. They spend their money on themselves and develop new lifestyles for men. For example, tway-tweffing. Many such men live modestly, save and invest hard, and retire in their 40s, often then moving to a poor third world country where the cost of living is much less, and spend the second half of their lives doing what they love. These new priorities for men need to be broadcast to society, and particularly to women. It's not enough that women become FIPs. It's also necessary that the gender laws be made men fair. For example, in the case of divorce, alimony needs to be thrown out. Custody of children needs to be made joint by default. The house is kept by the original owner or owners. And divorcing couples be encouraged to buy a cheap nearby apartment that they alternate in. With 1 week the father is with the kids in the house while the mother is in the apartment, and the next week they swap. The paternity rejection right, that's P-A-R-E-R by the way, paternity rejection right, needs to be brought in, meaning legislated. Women have the MARA, obviously maternity rejection right, aka abortion right. A woman has the legal right to reject a maternity she does not want. Men have no such equivalent right, making the lack of a para, which would allow a man to fill in a government form to reject paternity, so that if the woman goes ahead with the pregnancy, then she has full financial responsibility for the kid from then on. One of the most blatant examples of sexual discrimination against men that exists. The fluffy feminists will fight the legislation of the para with tooth and nail, because if it comes in, in other words, if it is legislated by the gender politicians, then it will force all women to be FIPs, and that prospect scares the shit out of most older women who grew up with fluffy expectations, and so never grew up to become responsible adults. They always had in the back of their minds that some manslave would succumb to her vagina and pay for her. The MGTOWs and Masculists will have a verbal war against the fluffy feminists. As the birth rate continues to remain well below the replacement rate, for example in Japan it's 1.4 children per woman compared to the replacement rate of 2.1, the population will inevitably fall, as it is already starting to do in Japan. In a mere 2 decades after the baby boomers have died off, the Japanese population will fall to about 2/3 of its current figure, to about 80 million. Japanese politicians are already pulling their hair out, wondering how to persuade young men to have more babies. In Japan, the herbivore men, that's grass eaters, that is MGTOW men, the Japanese version of, are having real political impact. This is my 3rd video for the evening and my voice is starting to go. In the Western countries, things are about a decade behind, but the trend is the same. So it's only a question of time before the Western gender politicians start asking men, what's wrong? The Masculists and MGTOWs will tell these gender politicians that it stinks to be a man in our current gynocentric culture, where men's rights are neglected and abused, particularly in the divorce courts. As the broadcast media gets in on the act, Masculist and MGTOW ideas will become widely known, and the fluffy feminists will begin to be fearful that the gender laws will be men-faired, the divorce laws will be made fair to men, and serious talk that the para should be legislated will begin. Once that happens, the fluffy feminists will pull out all their stops to fight it, which is when the MGTOWs and Masculists need to really get out there and harangue the fluffy feminists for their hypocrisy, in capital letters. Masculists particularly need to tell the broadcast media that fluffy feminists are two-faced hypocrites who want their cake and to eat it too. Fluffy feminists want equal rights with men, but not equal obligations, that is, sharing out the burdens with men, especially in terms of becoming career competent and becoming FIPs. Fluffy feminists are still fluffies. They have had their feminist consciousness raised, but not their masculist consciousness. So by default, they still have traditional female attitudes and expectations towards men. That is, they see men as cash machines, which is an attitude that masculists despise. Quote, this is one of the major masculist sayings for women. Quote, "I'm more than a cash machine, you bitch," end quote, is a catchy masculist slogan. The masculists can get on the broadcast media and pile on the venom against the fluffy feminists, calling them immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out. Masculists can point to the young women who are now becoming FIPs at a much greater rate than a decade or two back and tell the older women, quote, "Look at young women. They see the writing on the wall. They are FIPping. They know that they won't even be able to get a man to tway-twef with them if they aren't FIPs. But you fluffy feminists are still fluffies, so are the enemy. In fact, you're worse than fluffies, because you're hypocrites. You are hated by the masculist MGTOWs, for whom you are the first category of females to be rejected by them. You will be forced by men to rot on the shelf to extinction. You are vermin." End quote. To the gender politicians, the masculists and MGTOWs will say, quote, "If you gender politicians don't mend fair society and the gender laws, then we MGTOWs masculists will continue our rejection of paternity and hence wipe out whole populations." End quote. So, there's a long way to go. The battle for the liberation of men is only half won. We still need to teach society and women that men will no longer tolerate being manslaves to fluffies and being dumped on by the broadcast media. We men are the superior sex, outperforming women at the top end of the performance scores. We invent everything. We win 99% of the Science Nobel Prizes. If all females died tomorrow, men would live on for a century. Actually, probably longer, because men would go on a crash research program to solve the problem. If all males died tomorrow, the female population would crash within 6 months because women are incapable of running a modern society. They couldn't even keep the machines running and would starve. The battle is only half won, guys. Keep up the pressure. Keep pushing women to be FIPs. Keep shitting on the fluffy feminists, and keep threatening the gender politicians to men-fair the gender laws, or we wipe out whole populations. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name de GARIS, MGTOW, Masculist, Flyers. Cheers.